play it any louder, then it's getting shut down.
My name is Waffles, and I'm a government whistleblower turned political commentator, and this is the last 24 hours in the news. Today is October 29, 2025. It is 6:38 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Real quick before we get started, I had an emergency last night and was unable to do my reporting. I have not slept. And so I am going to do what I can to try and include anything that may have been missed because the report was prepared, but then an emergency happened. Here are the top U.S. news highlights for the past 24 hours. Emergency Supreme Court petition, Copyright Office removal. The administration filed an emergency application asking the U.S. Supreme Court to allow the president to remove the Register of Copyrights, Shreya Perlmutter, after lower court rulings blocked a unilateral firing. This is a live constitutional test of presidential removal power over officials embedded in the Library of Congress and could reshape agency independence if the court intervenes. State lawsuits and funding fights continue. Multiple state attorneys general and advocacy coalitions have continued or escalated litigation challenging federal funding reallocations and program cancellations tied to the administration's budget actions and shutdown posture. These suits argue imminent harm to benefits recipients and public services. National Guard and federal forces legal fights remain active. Potential for rapid change. Courts are actively reviewing and rehearing questions about the administration's authority to deploy National Guard or federal forces to cities, Chicago, Portland, and others. A Ninth Circuit decision to rehear the Portland matter in Bank and Supreme Court level questions about Chicago deployments mean judicial orders could flip quickly and produce immediate operational consequences. No new large-scale domestic troop mobilization was announced in the last 24 hours, but the litigation posture keeps mobilization risk alive. Domestic extremist threat environment. Law enforcement and analysts continue to treat far-right militia-style threats as principal domestic risk. No verified new mass attack incidents were reported overnight. Monitoring of local threat reports and FBI briefings remains warranted. However, there was, again, more recent shootings. Administration threats of legal action, pressure on civilians or politicians. The administration has continued using funding leverage and public threats to withhold or reallocate federal monies as a political and policy tool. These moves are fueling state litigation and direct harm claims from service providers and beneficiaries. Policy shifts and institutional power. State and federal risks to well-being. If the Supreme Court grants the emergency removal request, the precedent would expand presidential control over certain agency posts. That could accelerate personnel churn across independently situated positions and weaken administration safeguards, rulemaking, and enforcement, for example, that protect public interests. Healthcare and safety net funding remain at risk. States, including large states that reported imminent impacts, say threatened cancellations or delays in federal reimbursements would materially harm hospitals, public health programs, and SNAP recipients, effects that are already the subject of emergency litigation. Power outage aftermath and localized infrastructure stress. Houston area utilities reported a large outage event. Most service has been restored, but localized restoration and infrastructure repair remain active. These events have downstream consumer implications. Hospitals, transit signals, food spoilage in severe weather or wind threats reappear this weekend. Outage risk grows. Budget and shutdown actions are creating consumer-facing risks. The uncertainty and litigation over federal payments can cause interruptions in services, benefit payments, reimbursements to providers that directly affect households and small businesses. Measles and vaccine preventable disease surveillance. Elevated activity in 2025. The CDC's measles tracking pages were updated recently and show that 2025 has seen elevated measles activity compared with recent years. State health departments are issuing localized guidance and outbreak responses. Public health capacity in affected jurisdictions. Contact tracing, MMR clinic access, for example, is an immediate reporting angle. No new national public health emergency was announced in the last 24 hours. Diplomatic and trade posture continuing to drive economic and security ties. Recent U.S. diplomacy on critical minerals and expanded alliance activity in Asia, Japan, and India remains the dominant international thread affecting U.S. trade, supply chains, and security cooperation. Reporting in the last 24 hours highlighted these threads and their domestic economic implications. Global conflicts and storms shape policy levers. Ongoing Russia-Ukraine dynamics and major storms in the Caribbean, which affect U.S. humanitarian and strategic responses, are short-term drivers of U.S. foreign policy attention and potential resource commitments. Supreme Court emergency petition on copyright office removal filed by the administration, live and urgent. Trump has formally filed an appeal of his Manhattan hush money conviction. The appeal was filed, updated publicly within the past 24 hours. It keeps the criminal litigation track active and moving toward appellate review. Multiple other suits and appeals, funding deployments, agency decisions continue across district and appellate courts. Litigation trackers report frequent emergency filings and appeals in the last day. The emergency Supreme Court petition on the Copyright Office and the filing of the Manhattan appeal are the most immediately consequential shock legal moves in the last 24 hours. Both change public legal calendar and narrative quickly. Lewd or inappropriate conduct. Any new verified reports of lewd, sexual misconduct, or any other appropriate behavior. No newly verified allegations pushed by major outlets. Historical allegations remain on the record, but no fresh verified incidents. Supreme Court docket. Watch for the acceptance or denial of the Emergency Copyright Office petition. Outcome will be immediate and precedent-setting. District and appellate dockets on guard. Federal forces, Chicago, Portland, Oregon, any new emergency motion or en bloc decision can flip operational deployments within hours. State litigation on federal funding, SNAP, and healthcare orders could force or prevent payment disruptions affecting millions, track filings, and emergency relief motions. That's according to Democracy Docket. Local utility restoration bulletins in outage areas and CDC state measles pages for new case reports. Immediate human impact items for consumer and public health coverage. These are things to keep an eye on. A federal judge temporarily blocked open banking rule by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. The rule would have made it easier for consumers to switch financial service providers. Blocking it delays those switching benefits and raises concerns about regulatory support for consumer choice. Yeah, that's a good thing that we should be questioning right now. It certainly appears that there's people manipulating the market, so consumer choice should definitely be a topic of discussion. I should have a right to choose where I shop. When motherfuckers are manipulating the markets, I don't have that kind of choice when people are being forced to close their businesses. And I certainly expect that this is the direction that all of these tariffs are going in. Other than that, as far as what we can expect for and the tariffs, it's going to be an ongoing shit show. There is no foreseeable end to the tariffs. So expect the motherfucker, Shitler, who has earned that title, to continue to recklessly issue tariffs, whether they be under IEEPA or not. Expect market volatility throughout the duration of what is possibly 4 years of this asshole. So consumer finance policy, why it matters, often flies under the radar but has direct impact on millions via fees, data access, and credit. For more information, pull docket details with which industry groups were behind with the challenge and which states are likely to expand their own switching rules in the meantime. A U.S. appeals court paused a daily court appearance order for a top border official tied to immigration crackdown litigation in Chicago. So if this is the same individual that I think it is, then this asshat has been ordering ICE to tear gas people, and if I am not mistaken, had ICE tear gas a parade of children that were engaging in a civic activity, tear gassed by ICE. Why it matters? This is a procedural but strategically important development in federal and control conflicts over immigration enforcement. Investigate the official's role if you would like more information on this, how this pause affects enforcement in Chicago, and local civil rights groups' reactions. So his required court appearance has been paused. That is what's going on with the asshat, who thinks it's appropriate to issue tear gas on children. For those who are not aware, tear gas can be lethal towards children. If somebody has a smaller body and they get tear gassed, they are more likely to die because their body cannot freaking handle it. Real fucked up, if you ask me, what this asshat has been doing. 3 U.S. cities have filed a complaint alleging that federal funds for local policing were conditioned unlawfully by the administration. Conditioning of federal grants to local governments is a direct governance issue, potential risk to community policing oversight, and local state-federal relations. Identify the cities if you would like more information, the specific conditions being challenged, and whether this pressure shifts policing priorities or local budgets. A senior DOJ nominee acknowledged he inadvertently misspoke during Senate confirmation about the White House DOJ communications policy. Why it matters: transparency and independent prosecutor standards are core to legal governance accountability. A slip in this area could reflect deeper operational issues. If you would like to look further into this issue, look into his previous record, what the inadvertent statement covered, and how oversight committees are responding. Large regional power outage restoration still ongoing in the Houston area. Utilities severe weather, though not exclusive to a new event overnight. Why it matters: infrastructure strains, electricity impacts hospitals, transit vulnerable populations, and is a watch item. Check the latest coverage maps if you would like more information, utility CEO statements, and whether federal disaster funds or mutual aid have been activated. State Health Department data indicates an uptick in vaccine-preventable disease, measles, clusters in specific counties, emanating from the last 24-hour updates. Public health risk in specific jurisdictions may precede national headlines. A local outbreak response is important. If you would like more information surrounding this issue, identify which counties, check clinic and school responses, and ask state DPH for latest numbers. A lesser reported trade and tariff resolution in the Senate. A resolution moved to block certain tariffs on Canada, though overshadowed by larger headline items. Why it matters: trade policy shifts often influence supply chains, consumer prices, and regional economies. This could have local economic implications. For more information, track exact tariff categories affected, how Canadian industries respond, whether U.S. producers feel pressure, and which regions and states are economically exposed. And today the stock markets closed with the S&P 500 at $687.39, up slightly. The Dow Jones at $476.37, down slightly. And Invesco QQQ at $635.77, up 0.47%. I am sleep deprived. I will not be digging for specific numbers. I don't know why I don't have my numbers today. The Energy Information Administration, EIA data, this is our economic report, shows large inventory draws. U.S. crude oil, gasoline, and distillate fuel stocks each fell more than expected last week. Crude dropped by nearly 7 million barrels versus a forecast of 0.2 million. This draw helped fuel a rise in oil prices. Federal Reserve rate cut decision. Despite weak data, the Fed cut its policy rate by 25 basis points in its second cut of the year, but Chair Jerome Powell emphasized a December cut is not a foregone conclusion, citing inflation pressures and labor market downside risks. Trade deal reached with South Korea. The U.S. and South Korea finalized details of a trade agreement. South Korea will invest $350 billion in the U.S., including $200 billion in cash, $150 billion shipbuilding cooperation. U.S. tariffs on South Korean goods, especially autos, will be reduced from 25% to 15%. Whether a formal agreement has been signed, I have no idea. Something to look into. Government shutdown threatens TIPS. TIPS. That's an acronym. Inflation data mechanics. Because data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics are delayed by the shutdown, the U.S. Treasury may need to use a fallback method to index Treasury inflation-protected securities, TIPS, adding uncertainty and risk premiums in the inflation-linked markets. Oil prices up on inventory draw and trade optimism. Oil prices, Brent and WTI, rose as markets digested the inventory draw and optimism around U.S.-China trade talks and the Korea deal. This has implications for consumer energy costs and inflation. Food aid shutdown cost warnings. Senate Democrats are publicly blaming the president for cutting SNAP benefits for millions during the shutdown. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the cost of the shutdown to the U.S. economy could reach $14 billion. Implications and what to watch. The inventory draw and oil price rise may feed into inflation, complicating the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and employment. Stability is very important for national security and national stability and economic stability. Stability is important. Stability is something that matters for the well-being of the nation. The South Korea trade deal may ease some tariff pressures and reshape investment and supply chain flows, but its full implementation will be key for consumer and manufacturing sectors. The shutdown's impact on data such as for inflation and jobs creates a blind spot for policymakers and markets. That makes forward guidance riskier. Consumer energy costs could tick up if oil prices sustain, affecting vulnerable households and feeding inflation pressures. SNAP benefit interruptions and budget fights may directly impact low-income populations. Reporters should watch how state agencies respond and whether the federal funding gap expands. With that being said, since we're talking about SNAP, I just want to remind everybody that 40% of SNAP recipients, if I'm correct, are children. A lot of SNAP recipients do work. There's also people who are disabled, as well as the elderly receiving SNAP benefits. If an employer is paying somebody so little that they have to rely on food stamps, it is the employer who is the welfare queen, not the person trying to feed themselves if they're working full-time and still have to receive SNAP. Other than that, these programs are supposed to be a safety net for people dealing with emergencies, considering that there has been literally millions now of layoffs and people losing their jobs amid horrible jobs numbers for this embarrassment of a president. People need those benefits due to the fact that there's no work and they're being forced out of their jobs. So this is an asinine move, and I think it's being done with criminal intent, and it needs to be criminally investigated. And here is the upcoming hazardous weather outlook for the next few days. West Pacific States, Mountain West, Intermountain. Expect gusty winds, especially in open high terrain and mountain passes, particularly on Wednesday and into Thursday. Overnight lows will become colder than many expect for this time of year, especially in higher elevations, e.g. some mountain valley lows might drop near or below freezing. 0 degrees Celsius, which would be 32 degrees Fahrenheit. 32 degrees Fahrenheit is exactly freezing. That is the freeze point temperature. Key risks include travel disruptions on passes, wind and cold, tree limb or power line damage due to wind, freezing of pipes and equipment in colder elevations. Central U.S. Plains and Midwest. The Plains and Midwest are slated for strong gusty winds into Wednesday and Thursday, with rapidly dropping overnight lows. For example, Wednesday morning may bring lows near the upper 20s Fahrenheit, which is -2 degrees Celsius in some inland spots. Key risks: wind-related damage, trees and power lines, outages, exposure of vulnerable populations to cold overnight, potential for road and bridge icing in certain rural zones. Although no major convective storm outbreak is highlighted, high wind and low chill are significant for infrastructure and public safety. South and southeast. While large severe storms are not broadly forecast, the South should remain alert for gusty winds associated with advancing fronts. Overnight lows inland may approach freezing in some typically milder climate areas, a shock risk for agriculture and outdoor workers as well as vulnerable populations. Key risks include unexpected frost and freeze overnight, wind damage, especially loose objects and light structures. Expect the things in your yard to blow around. If you have a folded out lawn chair, consider putting it in your garage. Localized infrastructure stress, power and water. Northeast and mid-Atlantic, the region will face strong gusty winds on Wednesday with overnight lows dipping into the 30s. That's Fahrenheit. I don't know why I'm beeping so much. Inland, this combination raises risk for cold exposure, especially among outdoor workers, transit users, or vulnerable populations. Key risks include wind and cold stress on infrastructure, older buildings, exposed pipes, transit disruptions, and outdoor sheltering risk. Here are the top international news highlights for the past 24 hours. Hurricane Melissa, a Category 5 landfall and regional relief mobilization. The storm slammed Jamaica as a Cat 5 hurricane, caused major flooding, power outages, and thousands taking refuge. It then made landfall in Cuba as a Category 3 and is moving towards the Bahamas. The U.S. State Department and U.S. military are deploying disaster relief and search and rescue assets to Jamaica and the Bahamas and the Dominican Republic. This is a major natural disaster event with humanitarian infrastructure and climate vulnerability implications for the Caribbean and U.S. response logistics. What to watch: damage assessments, international aid flows, secondary disaster risks, flooding and landslides, and whether the storm's path shifts into regions with weaker disaster preparedness. Gaza conflict escalation. As we all already probably know, the ceasefire was a load of horse crap. Israeli 100 plus. That's a significant number. Amid ceasefire claims, Israeli forces launched strikes in the Gaza Strip that killed over 100 Palestinians, including many children, overnight, despite a U.S.-mediated ceasefire. Hamas described the strikes as a treacherous escalation. Why it matters: the ceasefire is now under serious strain. Renewed large-scale violence could expand regional risk, prompt humanitarian crises, and shift U.S. diplomatic and military engagements. What to watch: whether full military operations resume, how regional actors Egypt, Qatar, Iran respond, and how humanitarian corridor is impacted. This is really not good because it poses a significant risk to the people of Israel. There has been a significant amount of people out there protesting. Nobody likes Netanyahu unless you're a jackass or a dumbass that has no idea what's going on. I do care about civilian populations in any war and all wars, and so I find this concerning. Because what Netanyahu is doing is he's creating a situation where his repeated violations of the ceasefires makes it so that any attempts to negotiate for peace and neutrality are appearing as fatal and pointless. He is representing himself as a person that is absolutely out of control. And I have concern that that behavior may result in escalation that is likely a danger to the entire region. I don't know what it's going to take. It would be what if the people of Israel can find a way to get the motherfucker out of there. It might be in their best interest. Netanyahu is clearly a security risk to the entire globe. And when we have these leaders that want to repeatedly violate ceasefire attempts, how do you negotiate with somebody like that? How do you make them stop? Other than that, as far as Both Putin and Trump are concerned anybody who is making this world a more dangerous place for others is the problem. The people who are going out and bombing and harming innocent civilians, regardless of who they are, those people are the problem. And they are a threat to us all, and it is those individuals that need to be held accountable and stopped if we are to go back into peacetime and stop what appears to be a globally escalating conflict. Donald Trump and South Korea finalize a trade deal, shift Asia's strategy. On the sidelines of an Asia-Pacific forum in South Korea, President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung announced a trade deal framework with commitments and indications of future tariff reductions, including hopes for engagement with China. Why it matters, this deal signals a shift in U.S. trade strategy in East Asia with implications for regional supply chains, tariffs, and geopolitical positioning. What to watch? Details of the deal, tariff levels, quotas, investment commitments, China's reaction to and downstream economic impacts in Korean U.S. manufacturing. Expanded rapid response forces for domestic civil disturbances in the U.S. The U.S. Department of Defense and National Guard plans to field quick action forces in each state. Hundreds of troops per state. This is a reminder to the American military. You work for the American people. Trump is a fucking jackass and he is a threat to national security. When you come to our states, we should meet up and have some breakfast. Let's have some donuts. Let's have some eggs and vibe out since this motherfucker's wasting our money. Why don't you, now seems to be a good time to work on public relations and we should all get to know each other. Let's turn this into a party rather than a problem. Hundreds of troops per state by 2026 to respond to civil disturbances. This follows an executive order by the president. Why it matters, this raises governance and civil rights stakes domestically and internationally. Military role inside U.S. borders is elevated, which may attract scrutiny from human rights observers and prompt state and federal conflict. Now seems like a good time to support your local restaurant industry. What to watch, implementation timelines, how states are preparing, what missions these forces will undertake, oversight mechanisms, and public and community reaction. Latin America and Caribbean multi-country humanitarian and security pressure. Several items. Haiti and Jamaica heavily impacted by Hurricane Melissa. Regional security tension around deployment and aid movement. Broader Caribbean rescue operations are being stood up. Why this matters, the Caribbean remains vulnerable to climate shock and geopolitical interests. U.S. humanitarian military involvement intersects with regional stability, economic aid flows, and migration risk. What to watch, aid flow, transparency, migration, and emergency relief patterns, how local governments manage recovery, and whether regional instability worsens due to compounded crisis, e.g. disaster plus economic plus security. That concludes today's last 24 hours in the news. We're going to do a brief review for anything that may have been missed. There's a lot of duplicate items in my daily reporting because we track things, and if something lapses over, something I'm doing every 24 hours, we don't need to doubly report on those items. So I'm just going to go through yesterday's report now, and we're going to see if there's anything additional that we need to catch up on. Alright, so this is similar to what we've already reported, but still important. Multiple states are suing or threatening suits over the federal decisions to withhold or reallocate funds. In the last 24 hours, a coalition of states and advocacy groups sharpened legal pressure over SNAP and other safety net funding decisions tied to the administration's budget and shutdown maneuvers. These suits argue imminent harm to millions of beneficiaries. Whether or not these are on the fast track and whether or not it's going to help save any of us, I have no idea. Domestic extremist threat environment, continuing vigilance, domestic terror, and violent extremist assessments remain elevated in many federal products. Law enforcement briefings and analysts continue to cite far-right and militia-style threats as primary domestic dangers. Administration threats or legal pressure against civilians and politicians. The administration has continued to use executive leverage, funding threats, cancellations, and public statements as policy tools. Recent actions include public threats to cancel or withhold previously approved funds during the shutdown. These leverage measures are already the subject of litigation and legislative pushback. Federal health care and funding cuts flagged for immediate harm. California officials and other state leaders say recent federal funding maneuvers are a problem, and proposed cuts will cause widespread loss of coverage and strain safety net hospitals, a near-term risk to millions if implemented. These claims are now part of litigation and state advocacy actions. Large power outage clusters in Texas, Houston area remain consequential center point, and Entergy appear to be utilities providers that are affected. Budget shutdown actions translate to or cancel spending, and the court fights that follow are already producing warnings from states about interrupted services such as SNAP health care reimbursements and immediate consumer-facing risk. Vaccine preventable diseases, measles. Y'all, measles be spreading. Measles be spreading like crazy in Texas. Trade talks. They're in Asia right now. Trump's legal defense team filed an appeal of his Manhattan criminal conviction in the New York State case. Pretty sure we just covered that. I think that's the hush money case. Yeah. Alright, looking for additional items, anything that was flying under the radar. Stuff about the copyright person they're trying to remove. National Guard deployments. Local judge extended restraining orders and courtroom activity around Guard deployments. Regional court coverage and TV reporting. Local court extensions and short hearings are where deployments often get paused or reauthorized. Local court transcripts and hearing minutes are a good and fast primary source for reporters. Houston outages, measles. Not really giving a damn about yesterday's stock market because we do that daily. Donald Trump and Xi Jinping trade negotiations under close watch. Just an announcement that that's going on right now. In the U.S. Senate, legislation passed 52-48 that would terminate the national emergency declaration underlying certain Trump-era tariffs on Brazilian imports. That step signals increased bipartisan opposition to broad tariff uses, though the bill now faces hurdles in the House of Representatives. This is according to the Economic Times. The economic calendar preview shows that the U.S. goods trade deficit is expected to widen in the September release, forecast $90 billion versus $85.5 billion in August, pressuring trade balance dynamics and thereby potentially the growth outlook. Though not new data in the past 24 hours, surveys referenced in recent coverage show that business confidence is dropping in response to the trade tariff jackassery. Yesterday's weather. And now we're looking at yesterday's international. We got some stuff about Zelensky. Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine ready for talks, but will not cede territory. Ukraine's president said Kiev is open to peace negotiations, but instead that Ukrainian forces will not withdraw from any territory as a precondition for talks. Moscow had demanded territorial concessions as part of preliminary discussions. Why it matters, the statement deepens the diplomatic standoff. It signals Ukraine will not play Moscow's terms, but also indicates readiness to shift towards negotiations, a potential turning point in war dynamics. What to watch, whether European allies coordinate funding tactics for Ukraine or pull back, whether Russia ups military pressure to force concessions. Middle East escalation in Gaza, Israeli strikes and regional reactions. We just talked about this. It's a damn disaster. Netanyahu ordered intensive airstrikes, citing alleged ceasefire violations by Hamas. 9 civilians, including children, were reported killed. This is yesterday. Turkey condemned the action as a flagrant violation of the ceasefire. Somebody just needs to bitch slap some motherfucking fools. That is my opinion. Somebody needs to walk right up and bitch slap Netanyahu. Somebody also needs to walk right up and bitch slap Vladimir Putin. It would also be nice to see the same done to Donald Trump. Hurricane Melissa, we already covered that. Asia, Indo-Pacific, U.S.-India submarine hunting drills highlight China naval concern. The U.S. and India conducted a joint anti-submarine drill near Diego Garcia, involving P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, part of a broader U.S. alliance effort to counter China's expanding submarine force in the Indo-Pacific. What? Is that a place? Is Diego Garcia a place? Diego Garcia appears to be a place. Why it matters. This demonstrates the U.S. pivot point allied maritime power projection and China's increasing naval challenge, deepens strategic competition in the Indian Ocean and beyond. China's reaction, diplomatic or military, further drills and training expansions, whether this leads to visible naval escalation in contested waters. Alliances and diplomacy, U.S.-Japan Golden Era partner deal with new Japanese leader. President Donald Trump praised Japan's new Prime Minister Sanae Takaishi, calling the alliance at the strongest level. They discussed a major investment framework, $490 billion in commitments, and critical minerals cooperation. Signals a major shift in U.S.-Japan relations and the wider Asian alliance system, especially notable given past trade tensions and Japan's role in regional supply chains and defense. What to watch, how China views or exploits the partnership, whether Japanese investment commitments are realized, and implications for regional trade investment flows. Looking to see if there's anything else we need to cover. Nope. All right, that's it.
So the Olympics is great. And Johnny, for the others, you know, the World Cup, Johnny is the head of it. We had our top people, Wasserman. They all came in on the Olympics, and then I saw Johnny. And we got the World Cup, too. And, you know, it's only because they rigged the election that I'll be your president representing you there. You know, I got both of them. I got the Olympics, and I got the World Cup. And I said, you know, it's too bad. One was in 2026, and the other was in 2028. And I said, I won't be there. I won't be your president. But then they rigged the election, and now we won, so I'm going to be your president for the Olympics and for the World Cup. So, Johnny, thank you for the World Cup, and everybody, thank you for the Olympics. We're going to have a great time.
Hey, guys, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment on my videos. And also, don't forget to check out my shop where you can get this awesome Real Patriots Punch Nazis t-shirt. America, fuck yeah! And if you go to the link tree in my bio on most platforms, it's got links to everything, all of my stuff. You can find my shop there. I'm on eBay. You can also get this cool Exterminate MAGA sticker, cause MAGA's fucking cockroaches. And fuck MAGA, abolish MAGA, fuck you MAGA.